She was going to lose everything by spring, and the blizzard that howled across Coldwell County on the night of January 14th, 1889, was the least of her problems. Elara Voss stood at her frosted window watching the white chaos consume what little she had left. The barn, the fence line, the memory of a life she'd once believed in, and felt nothing but the dull bone-deep certainty that this cold was not just the weather, it was a verdict. But on that same night, fate sent something else through the storm, something she wasn't prepared for, something she almost turned away. If you stay with me until the very end of this story, please hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind had been building since noon. By the time darkness fell over the Colorado plains, it had become something almost alive, a thing with claws and teeth that tore at the eaves of the Voss cabin and shook the door in its frame like a man trying to get inside whether he was wanted or not. Elara pressed her shoulder against the wood and listened to it scream. 3 months. That was how long Bernard Voss had been in the ground. 3 months since the horse had thrown him into the creek bed. 3 months since she'd knelt in the mud and pressed her palm to his chest and felt nothing moving beneath her hand. 3 months of waking alone, sleeping alone, eating alone in a cabin that had never been warm, even when two people lived in it. Bernard had not been cruel. She wanted to be fair to him, even in the privacy of her own mind. He'd been cold the way the plains were cold, vast and indifferent, concerned only with his own cycles, unaware that smaller things might need warmth to survive. He'd been 12 years older and twice as stubborn a man who measured love in the acres he'd cleared, and the debts he'd paid, and the meals that appeared on the table at 6 o'clock without fail. He'd never once asked her what she wanted. It simply hadn't occurred to him that she might want anything at all. Now the debt he'd left behind sat on her chest like a stone. Harlan Greer at the Coldwell County First Bank had been patient, almost suspiciously patient. 2 visits since Bernard's death, both times with that smooth, oil-slick voice telling her to take her time. These things sorted themselves out. A young woman in her position had options. The word options had sat in her stomach like something rotten. She knew what he meant. Sell the land cheap, move on, let the bank absorb what was left and call it settled. She hadn't sold. She'd planted a kitchen garden. In October's last warmth, she'd sold 2 of the 3 hogs. She'd traded 3 dozen eggs to Mrs. Dawes Harwick at the general store for a sack of flour and a quarter-pound of salt. She'd done everything short of begging, and she wasn't going to beg. Not yet, maybe not ever. The thermometer nailed to the cabin wall read 14 degrees inside. The woodpile outside was low enough to be frightening, and from the direction of the barn came a sound that stopped her heart cold. A bang, then another, then silence. The barn door. She'd latched it herself at dusk, double-checked the iron pin, said a small prayer to whatever forces governed the survival of livestock on the open plains. But this wind was something else. This was the kind of wind that rearranged the landscape, that buried fence posts overnight and turned familiar paths into unmarked graves. Elara didn't let herself think. She pulled on Bernard's old coat 3 sizes too large, smelling still faintly of the man she'd married and mourned, and tried to grieve properly, wrapped her scarf twice around her face and stepped out into the killing white. The cold was not like cold. It was like impact, like being hit. Her lungs seized and her eyes watered instantly, the tears freezing before they could fall. The wind shoved her sideways the moment she cleared the door, and she grabbed the porch post with both hands and stood there a moment, gasping, recalibrating. 30 yards to the barn, 30 yards in snow that was already knee-deep and still falling. She moved. It was not walking. It was something more primal, a negotiation with the elements, a yard at a time, her feet finding ground. She couldn't see her hands outstretched against the white. Nothing that had swallowed the world. The barn's shape appeared gradually, a dark solidity, assembling itself from chaos, and she found the door hanging half open, banging against the frame with every gust. She hauled it shut. She fought the latch into place. Inside, the silence was so sudden it felt like falling. Her own heartbeat was very loud. Bess, her last milk cow, stood in her stall, with her eyes showing white, her whole body trembling, in the particular way of an animal that has decided it might be dying. The 3 remaining chickens had piled themselves into a corner, pressed together for shared warmth. The small kerosene lantern Elara kept hung from the center beam still burned, casting amber light over the hay and the packed dirt floor. Everything accounted for. Everything present. She stood there a moment, letting her breathing slow, letting the relief wash through her. She would not lose Bess. Losing Bess meant losing the milk, the small income it generated, the last thin thread of financial viability. Losing Bess meant the banker won. She was about to turn back toward the door when she heard it, a sound that did not belong to the barn. Not the cow, not the chickens, not the wind finding gaps in the boards. A sound with rhythm to it, a slow, deliberate pattern of intake and exhale. The sound of a man breathing. Every instinct she possessed went very still. Her hand found the pitchfork that leaned against the near wall. Her fingers wrapped around the handle and the wood was cold through her gloves, and she didn't care. "Who's there?" she said. Her voice came out flat and hard, which surprised her. She'd expected it to shake. A pause. The breathing continued. "I know you're in here. Show yourself or I'll put this pitchfork through whatever part of you I find first." Movement in the shadows at the far end of the barn. Slow, deliberate movement, the movement of someone who understood that fast motion in a situation like this was the last mistake you'd ever make. He came into the light one piece at a time. Boots first caked with ice so thick they barely looked like boots. Then legs and a long body and broad shoulders, and finally a face weathered and bearded jaw, clenched against what she'd later recognize as pain eyes, the pale gray of winter clouds. He was tall enough that he had to angle his head slightly beneath the center beam. He was holding his left arm against his body in a way that was too careful, too deliberate, the posture of someone protecting something that hurt. He was not holding a weapon. "I'm not going to harm you," he said. His voice was quiet and rough, as if he hadn't used it much lately. "My horse lost the road in the storm. I saw your barn light. I was trying to get Colt out of the wind before he went down." Behind him in the shadows, she could now make out the shape of a large horse standing with its head low and its sides heaving. The animal was in bad shape. She could see it even from here, the glassy eyes, the trembling flanks. "That's my barn," she said. "Yes, ma'am, I know. I apologize for the trespass. How long have you been in here?" "Maybe an hour. I knocked at the cabin first." No answer. He paused. "You were probably asleep." She hadn't been asleep. She'd been sitting by the fire cataloging debts. But that wasn't the point. "Who are you?" she said. Not a question. A demand. He met her eyes steadily. His own didn't waver, and she noted that a man in a bad position who didn't look away. "Reed Calloway. Out of Denver originally, though I've been moving around." "What kind of man moves around in January?" "The kind with nowhere particular to be." A muscle in his jaw tightened. "And a problem I'm not sure how to solve." "What problem?" He shifted, and even in the amber light, she could see it, the way the color left his face for just a moment, the sharp, involuntary breath he pulled in through his nose. His left hand went instinctively to his right shoulder. "Mr. Calloway, it's nothing." A man who says it's nothing while going gray in the face is lying. She moved the lantern closer, raised it, and looked at him properly. His coat was dark, and the dark was darker, in one place a wet spreading that started at his right shoulder and had soaked through to his collar. "You're bleeding." He looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, as if the admission cost him something, "Old wound." The cold opened it back up. "Old wound," she repeated. "From what?" Another long pause. The horse shifted behind him. "A bullet," he said, "8 months ago. Healed mostly." Mostly. She looked at him. He looked at her. The wind screamed around the barn walls and the lantern swayed. "If I go back to my cabin and get my kit," she said carefully, "and come back out here to patch that wound, and you use the time I'm gone to steal my horse or my cow or anything else on this property, I will track you down, Mr. Calloway, and whatever's left of my goodwill will not survive the experience." His expression shifted. Not a smile quite, but something in that direction. "That seems fair. Your horse can stay. You can stay in the barn. I'll come back with bandages." "Mrs. Voss, Elara Voss." She turned toward the door, then stopped. "The straw at the far end is driest. Keep your fire small and away from it." "I don't have another barn." She didn't wait for his answer. The walk back through the blizzard was somehow worse than the walk out had been, knowing. Now exactly what waited in the warm cabin. Exactly how cold the 30 yards between them were. Exactly how foolish she was being. She was a widow alone on 45 acres in the dead of a Colorado winter, and she was going back to tend the wound of a man who admitted to being shot and had no explanation for why. She went anyway, because the horse was going to die if she didn't, because the man might too, and because 3 months of being alone on these plains had taught her that there were worse things than being a fool. Being the kind of person who could let living things suffer to preserve her own comfort, that was worse. She gathered what she needed from the cabin, the tin box that held Bernard's old medical supplies, a clean cloth, the bottle of carbolic she'd bought 6 months ago and never opened a heel of bread, and the last of the dried beef she'd been saving. She packed it all into a sack and went back out into the storm. He was exactly where she'd left him. He'd made a small fire in a circle of stones. Her stones from the smoke ring she used in summer, and he was sitting with his back against the hay bale, his horse's nose pressed against the top of his head, in what looked almost like affection. He'd removed his coat. His shirt beneath was dark with old blood and new. "Take it off," she said, sitting down beside him. He didn't argue, which she respected. The shirt came off with effort. His face went very still with the controlled expression of someone managing significant pain, and she saw the wound properly for the first time. High on the right shoulder, the exit wound still visible as a gathered pucker of scar tissue, and beside it the entry scar, both of them irritated and seeping where the cold had cracked the healed skin. "Clean," she said, meaning the wound itself, though barely. "No sign of new infection. If you'd waited another day in this cold, it would have been a different story." "I wasn't planning to stop," he said. "Nobody plans to stop." She poured carbolic over the cloth and pressed it to the wound without warning. He made no sound, which told her the pain tolerance of this man was either extraordinary or he'd simply been through worse things than this and was comparing accordingly. "What brought you to Coldwell County?" she said, working. "The road north. I was following it." "From Denver?" "Yes." "What's north?" A pause. "Distance from Denver." She looked up at him. He was watching the fire, not her face. His jaw set, his eyes, doing something complicated that she couldn't quite name. "You're not going to tell me about the bullet," she said. "I'll tell you what I can." "Then tell me what you can." He was quiet for a moment. The wind pushed against the barn walls with a sustained shuddering force that made the boards flex. "I used to be a detective," he said at last. "Private work, mostly out of Denver. I was good at it. Good at finding things people wanted hidden. Good at reading situations. Good at knowing when something wasn't what it looked like." He stopped. 8 years ago, I worked a case. A man was accused of murder. I put together the evidence that convicted him. He hanged for it. Elara kept working, kept her hand steady. And 6 months ago, I found out I was wrong." His voice was flat, the flatness of something that had been pressed down by a very heavy weight for a very long time. New evidence came to light. The real killer was identified. The man I helped convict was innocent. He paused. Had been innocent. Was already dead. She tied off the bandage, sat back, looked at him for a long moment. "That's why you left Denver." "Couldn't stay. Couldn't look at the places I used to work and pretend it didn't happen." He finally looked at her. His pale eyes were steady, level, the gaze of someone who was not looking for absolution and knew better than to ask for it. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because you asked, and I don't see any reason to lie to someone who just cleaned a gunshot wound in a blizzard." "That's reasonable," she said. "Most people, when I tell them, they either think I should be in prison or they tell me it wasn't my fault. Neither one is particularly useful. What do you think?" He looked back at the fire. "I think I should have been more careful. I think certainty is a dangerous thing when a man's life depends on your accuracy, and I think I have to figure out how to live with it." She stood, gathered her supplies, looked down at him, this large, quiet, damaged man, sitting in her barn with his shirt off in January, his horse sleeping peacefully behind him, the fire burning small and controlled between the stones he'd arranged with evident care. "The bread is in the bag," she said, "and the beef. I don't have much to spare, but I have that." He looked up, startled. "Mrs. Voss, don't argue. Eat something. You're going to need your strength if you're going to fix the section of my barn roof that tore off in the southwest corner before this storm is done with us." A pause. I wasn't aware I'd agreed to fix your barn roof. You haven't yet, but you will. She picked up the lantern. Because you need somewhere to sleep tonight, and I'm the only option, and you're the kind of man who doesn't take without giving back. I can see that much already. She left him with the lantern, the fire, the food, and something she could feel him watching, not with threat, not with calculation, but with an expression she couldn't quite see in the darkness behind her, and wasn't ready to name yet. In the cabin, she banked the fire and sat in Bernard's chair, and didn't sleep for a very long time. The storm passed before dawn, leaving behind a world remade in white. Elara woke to silence after hours of howling, and for a disoriented moment, she thought she was somewhere else entirely. Some cleaner, emptier version of her life where nothing had accumulated yet and everything was still possible. Then the cold settled back over her and she remembered. She dressed quickly, 2 pairs of wool socks inside Bernard's 2 large boots, 2 shirts under the coat, the scarf wrapped high enough to cover her chin. Outside, the snow was hip-deep in the drifts and knee-deep in the open, the air so cold and clear it hurt to breathe. The sun was just cresting the eastern horizon, painting the white landscape in shades of pink and copper. And despite everything, despite the mortgage, and the empty pantry, and the stranger in her barn, Elara stood on her porch for just a moment and acknowledged that it was beautiful. The plains were brutal and indifferent and occasionally magnificent, and she had learned over 3 years here to take the magnificence when she found it. She waded through the snow to the barn. He was already awake. Already working, in fact, she heard the sounds before she opened the door, the rhythmic scrape and thud of someone moving bales. She stopped in the doorway and looked. Reed Calloway had repacked the hay bales she hadn't realized had shifted, rebuilt the small stone smoke ring, and she looked closer, replaced the loose pin on Bess's stall gate that had been rattling since September. He was working one-handed, favoring the right shoulder, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone managing pain, but refusing to be stopped by it. He turned when he heard the door. He'd found a spare shirt somewhere in the barn. Bernard's old work shirt, she recognized it left hanging on the hook by the tack room, and it was too small in the shoulders and too short in the arms, but he'd put it on anyway, which she appreciated for reasons that had nothing to do with modesty. "Morning," he said. "You fixed the gate pin," she said. "It was going to go soon. Another week and the cow would have let herself out." "How's the shoulder?" "Manageable." He looked at her steadily. "I owe you for last night." "I know you do. Do you remember what I said about the barn roof?" Something flickered in his expression. "You said I'd agree to fix it." "I was right." She came fully inside, went to Bess's stall, fetched the milk pail. "Southwest corner. The snow that came in overnight is going to freeze into the hay and ruin it if we don't clear it and patch the gap before tomorrow night." "What do you have for materials?" "Scrap boards in the lean-to, some old shingles, rope and iron nails in the tack room." "That'll do?" He paused. "Mrs. Voss." She was settling onto the milking stool, hands already finding the familiar rhythm. "Elara." He was quiet for a moment, as if testing the word internally. "Elara, I need you to understand that I'm grateful for the shelter and for what you did last night. But I won't pretend to be something I'm not. I'm a man who made a serious mistake that cost someone his life. I'm not looking to be fixed or forgiven. I'm just looking to pay a fair debt." She kept milking. The warm smell of bess of hay and morning rose around her. "I didn't ask you to be fixed," she said. "I asked you to patch a roof." He was quiet for another moment. Then very quietly she heard him almost laugh, not quite, but almost. A sound that seemed to surprise him. "The ladder's in the lean-to," she said. "I'll bring coffee when you're set up." She did bring coffee. She made it strong because he looked like a man who needed it strong, and she carried it out to the base of the ladder in the brittle morning cold and stood at the bottom, watching him work on the roof above her. He'd taken the bandage off his shoulder. She'd see him wincing, but keeping both hands moving, slow and deliberate, prying away the damaged shingles and replacing them with careful precision. "Tell me about the farm," he called down when the silence between them had stretched long enough to become something other than awkward. 45 acres, she said. 20 cleared, rest is rough pasture down to the creek. Bernard, my husband, he never got the south field properly drained. Floods every spring. Drainage tile would fix it." "I don't have drainage tile, or the money for it." "No, I imagine not." A pause, the sound of a hammer. "What do you plan to plant?" Whatever I can afford to put in the ground, wheat mostly, maybe some kitchen vegetables. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. If I make it to spring, what happens if you don't? She looked up at him. He was looking down at her steady, neither pitying nor judgmental, just asking. Harlan Greer at the county bank forecloses. He's been circling for months. He gave me until spring thaw to make a payment I can't make. Reed said nothing for a moment, just looked at her. Then he turned back to the roof. What do you know about Greer? He's the most powerful man in Coldwell County. He's been in that bank for 15 years. He's got his fingers in most of the property around here. She paused. Why bay? Just asking. Another careful nail. How many other farms has he foreclosed on in the past 2 years? She thought about it. The Whitmers left last March. The Dalton widow she sold in the fall. Dorothy Pike next door she's fighting to hold on. She paused. Are you suggesting something? I'm not suggesting anything, he said, just noticing a pattern. He went back to work, and she stood at the bottom of the ladder thinking about patterns and about what it meant that the one person to suggest she look more carefully at Harlan Greer was a stranger who had appeared in a blizzard and admitted to being shot. She went back to the cabin to start the beans soaking for dinner. She heard the crash 40 minutes later. Not a board falling, not a shingle sliding, a sudden heavy impact followed by silence. She was out the door before she'd consciously decided to move, running through the snow in Bernard's boots, and she found him in the drift below the south lean-to, flat on his back, with his eyes closed and his right hand pressed to his shoulder. She knelt beside him in the snow, put her hand to his face. His skin was cold, but not dangerously so, and she could see his chest rising. Reed, sharper than she intended. His eyes opened, pale gray against the white world. Lost my footing, he said. His voice was calm, which was somehow worse. Shoulder gave out. Can you stand? Give me a moment. She didn't give him a moment. She got her arms under his left arm and pulled, and he was heavier than he looked. All of it solid, no softness anywhere. But he found his feet with her help and stood swaying against her for just a second before steadying himself. You're done on the roof, she said. The south corner isn't finished. It's finished enough. Come inside. She kept her grip on his arm. He didn't fight her. That more than anything told her how bad the shoulder was. She put him in the kitchen chair, Bernard's chair, the only chair in the house that was any good. She heated the last of the water she'd fetched that morning and made it into something that approximated broth, a handful of dried herbs, a pinch of salt, the heel of bread she'd been saving. She put it in front of him and stood over him until he began to eat. You don't have much food, he said, looking at the bowl. No. You shouldn't waste it on me. I'm not wasting it. I'm making an investment. She sat down across from him. I need the south corner patched. I need the woodpile split and stacked before the next storm. I need the fence by the creek reset before spring floods. I need someone who knows how to do things with their hands and isn't going to keel over dead the first time something goes wrong. She looked at him across the table. You need somewhere to be that isn't a frozen road going nowhere. He looked at her for a long time. Mrs. Voss, Elara. He said it carefully, as if still testing it. I'm not the kind of man who makes things easier. I'm the kind who brings complications. You couldn't possibly bring complications I don't already have. She put her hands flat on the table. I'm offering you a straight deal. Room and board, which I'll admit isn't much of either, in exchange for labor. You stay in the barn or in my late husband's room if the cold gets bad enough. You don't come into my room without invitation. You don't make promises you can't keep. And when you're ready to leave, you leave. No drama, no debt. He looked at the bowl in his hands, at the fire, at her. I need to tell you something else, he said. Tell me. I'm not just passing through, that's what I planned. But I've been sitting on something since Denver, something I didn't know what to do with. It has to do with this county, with land transactions. He paused. With your bank. She felt the stillness settle over her. Say that again. In Denver before I left, I was looking into something, a pattern of property loss in rural counties. Banks acquiring land at distressed prices. Coldwell County came up more than once. He met her eyes. I didn't come here on purpose, but I'm here now. and I think you're right that Greer is circling. I think you might also be right that you don't have the whole picture yet. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind was building again, a low moan that said there was more weather coming. What picture? She said. That's what I'd like to find out. He set down the bowl. If you'll let me. She looked at him for a long time, at the wound she'd cleaned and dressed, at the hands that had spent the morning fixing what was broken before she'd asked them to, at the eyes that had told her a painful truth the night before when evasion would have been so much easier. 1 week, she said. You have 1 week, and then you tell me everything you know. He nodded once, and you finish the south corner, she added. The corner of his mouth moved. Almost a smile, not quite, but almost. Yes, ma'am, he said. He did finish the south corner. He also split 2 cords of wood over the next 3 days, working steadily, despite the shoulder stopping only when Elara made him. He restacked the wood pile against the barn wall out of the direct wind, the way Bernard had never thought to do it. And she stood looking at it one afternoon and tried to remember the last time she'd felt ahead of something rather than behind it. On the 4th day, a wagon appeared on the road from town. She saw it from the kitchen window, coming slow through the snow, with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with the conditions. She knew the wagon, a black-sided rig with a bay horse, the kind of wagon that said its owner wanted people to know he had money and considered it useful for them to think about. Jerome Voss. She had not seen Bernard's younger brother since the funeral, when he'd stood at the graveside with an expression she'd read at the time as grief. She understood now, watching him climb down from the wagon with a document case under his arm, that she'd misread it entirely. It hadn't been grief, it had been calculation. Reed came in from the barn just as she opened the cabin door to face Jerome on the porch. He saw her expression and stopped reading the situation in the particular way she was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through the world, taking in everything, sorting it immediately, filing it for use. He stayed inside, watching from the window. She appreciated that without fully being able to say why. Elara, Jerome said. He was smiling, which was the first sign of trouble. Jerome Voss was not a man who smiled without reason. It's good to see you managing so well out here. You're looking well. Jerome, she kept her hand on the doorframe. I wasn't expecting you. No, I imagine not. I've been dealing with some legal matters in town that took longer than expected. He opened the document case. I wanted to bring these to your attention before things became complicated. She looked at the papers he held out. Dense type official seals, her husband's name. What are these? She said. Documents establishing Bernard's debt to me, Jerome said pleasantly. We had a private arrangement, Elara. He borrowed substantially from me over the past 2 years. He was going to settle it with the sale of the East Pasture, but of course he died before that could happen. He tilted his head. I'm afraid that means the debt passes with the estate, which means it passes to you. She looked at the papers and then at Jerome's face and thought with a clarity that surprised her he is lying. She didn't know how she knew. She just knew. I'll need time to review those, she said. Of course, I'm not unreasonable. He smiled again. I just recommend sooner rather than later. The amount is significant, and Harlan Greer has been quite clear that additional liens on the property could trigger an accelerated foreclosure. We wouldn't want that. He tipped his hat and climbed back into the wagon. She closed the door. Reed was standing behind her. He'd crossed the room quietly while she wasn't looking, and now he was reading over her shoulder at the documents she'd carried inside, his expression very still. These are forgeries, he said. She looked up at him. How do you know? Because I've seen documents like these before. The seal is wrong. A county seal in Coldwell County has been updated twice in the last 5 years, and this one is using the 1882 version. He pointed. And because your brother-in-law's handwriting doesn't match the signature on the bottom, I'd bet money on it. She stared at the document. You can tell that just by looking. 8 years reading fraudulent paperwork will do that. His voice was flat professional, the voice of a man slipping back into a role he thought he'd abandoned. Jerome Voss didn't write this. Someone with legal training did. Someone who had access to the older county seal design. He paused. Someone like a banker who's been in this county for 15 years. Elara set the papers down on the table. Her hands were perfectly steady, which surprised her. She would have expected them to shake. Tell me everything you know about Harlan Greer, she said. Outside, the wind had started up again. The second storm of January was building on the horizon, gray and heavy, and full of the particular threat that the Colorado plains specialized in: not dramatic, not explosive, just relentless. The slow accumulation of impossible conditions until something gave way. Reed Calloway pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and she saw in his face the exact moment he made his decision, the moment he stopped running and started paying attention. "Sit down," he said. "This is going to take a while." She sat. The fire burned between them. Outside, the snow began to fall. And in Coldwell County, on the worst night of the worst winter in memory, two people who had every reason not to trust each other began to build something that the cold couldn't touch. Reed had a way of explaining things that made you feel like you were watching a map assemble itself. He didn't use dramatic language or build to obvious revelations. He simply laid out what he knew, one piece at a time, the way a careful man sets out tools before beginning a job, deliberately, with attention to sequence and weight. Elara sat across the kitchen table from him and listened, and with each piece she felt the shape of her situation shifting into something both worse and clearer than it had been. He had been tracking a pattern across 3 Colorado counties. In each case, a rural bank had acquired significant parcels of land over a 5-year period, land that belonged to widows, failed homesteaders, families hit by drought or illness. The acquisitions happened through a combination of foreclosure, purchase debt, and what the property records listed simply as negotiated settlement. In each case, the land was subsequently sold to outside investors at considerably higher prices. "Greer isn't just a banker," Reed said. "He's a middleman. He identifies distressed properties, creates or amplifies the distress, acquires them cheap, and sells them to investors in Denver and Colorado Springs who want large, consolidated parcels for cattle operations." "Creates the distress," Elara said. "How?" "Several ways. He's been known to call loans early on pretextual grounds, citing technicalities in the mortgage agreements that most people don't understand they've agreed to. He pressures other creditors to come forward at convenient times." He looked at her steadily. "He also, on at least 2 occasions, I could identify, actively suppressed documents that would have protected the property owner." "What kind of documents?" Reed's eyes didn't move from hers. "Wills, letters of credit, in one case a legitimate deed that predated the mortgage." Elara was very still for a moment. Then she stood up. "Bernard wrote a will," she said. "I know." She looked at him. "You know." "I've found a reference to it in county records. A will was filed with Greer's bank for safekeeping, which was apparently common practice in this part of the county 6 years ago, before the county clerk's office expanded. The filing was recorded. The will itself doesn't appear in any subsequent records." He paused. "It should have been submitted to probate after your husband's death." "It wasn't." The fire popped. Elara sat back down. Her mind was moving very fast in a very quiet way, assembling a picture she didn't want to see and couldn't stop looking at. "He hid it," she said. "I believe so." "What was in it?" "I don't know. I've only seen the filing reference." Reed leaned forward slightly. "But if Bernard left the farm to you outright, if there were provisions that would have simplified your claim to the property, a suppressed will would give Greer significant leverage. It would muddy the legal waters around ownership, make you dependent on the bank's goodwill." He paused. "And then Jerome shows up with forged debt documents to muddy the waters further, or to trigger additional liens that would force an accelerated foreclosure regardless of what the mortgage says." He looked at the papers still sitting on the table. "They're working together, Elara, your brother-in-law and your banker." She sat with that for a long moment. Out the window, the snow was thickening, the second storm of January arriving with the patient inevitability of something that had known all along where it was going. "What do I do?" she said. "We find the will." He said it simply, as if it were a reasonable thing. As if 2 people, a widow and a man with a compromised shoulder who had arrived in a blizzard 4 days ago, could simply walk into a bank and retrieve a document a powerful man had hidden. "Greer's office," she said. "His private records room. I've been in banks like his. The documents he doesn't want in the official ledgers he keeps separately. In a room he controls access to himself." He paused. "The bank is closed on Sundays." She looked at him. "You're suggesting we break in?" "I'm suggesting we go looking." He met her eyes. "I'm not asking you to come. In fact, I'd rather you didn't. But you should know what I'm planning. When I tell you I'm coming, she said, you're not going to argue with me about it. He studied her face for a moment. Then no, I don't expect I will. They waited 3 days. Reed used the time to observe the town riding in on Colt for ostensible supply purchases, spending time at the feed store listening cataloging. He was very good at listening. He had the particular gift of people who have spent years in investigative work. He could be completely unremarkable. He sat at the corner table in the feed store and nursed a cup of coffee and became in the perceptions of the people around him simply another traveling man passing through, and no one paid him any particular attention. He came back the second evening with what he'd learned. Greer goes to church Sunday morning, he said, sitting down at Elara's table. Services run 2 hours. His office manager, a man named Pratt, takes Sunday as a full day off. The bank has one lock on the front and one on the inner office. Standard pin tumbler mechanisms neither of them knew. Elara looked at him. You can pick locks. It's a useful skill in detective work. He paused. Also, the east window of the bank has a faulty latch that doesn't fully engage when closed. I noticed it when I was in there 2 days ago asking about exchange rates. He looked at her without particular expression. I wasn't planning this on the road from Denver. I want to be clear about that. I know, she said, and she did know, which was its own kind of strange. Sunday morning, she said, before services let out. That gives us 2 hours. She was quiet for a moment. Dorothy Pike, she said then, your neighbor. Her husband was a bookkeeper before he died, worked for Greer's bank for 6 years. Dorothy told me once that he used to bring work home, that she'd seen things she didn't fully understand. She looked at Reed. What if she saw more than she realized? He was very still for a moment. The particular stillness of someone who had just recognized a piece that fits somewhere important. You should talk to her, he said, carefully. Dorothy Pike was a sturdy woman in her late 40s who grew the best kitchen garden in Coldwell County and had the specific pride of someone who had survived significant difficulty and expected to continue doing so. She received Elara on Friday afternoon with tea and shortbread and the quiet pleasure of company. I've been worried about you over there, she said, alone all winter. I heard you had someone working on the barn roof, a traveler. He's helping with repairs, Elara said carefully. He knows his way around a farm. Dorothy refilled her cup without being asked, a sign of genuine warmth. It's sensible to get help while you can. Winter doesn't care about pride. She paused. What's really on your mind, Elara? Elara set down her cup. Jerome Voss came to see me. Dorothy's expression shifted slightly, just slightly, but Elara was learning these days to notice small shifts. Did he? He brought papers, documents claiming Bernard owed him money, private debts. She watched Dorothy's face. They aren't real, Dorothy. A pause, then carefully, how do you know? I have help. She paused. Your husband worked for Greer's bank. Dorothy looked at her tea. A long, weighted silence settled over the kitchen. Henry worked for Greer for 6 years, Dorothy said at last. Her voice had changed, quieter, more careful, as if she were reading from a document she'd memorized against her will. The last year was hard on him. He came home some nights looking troubled. He didn't say what it was. Henry was a private man, but I could see it. Dorothy. He kept copies, Dorothy said, of certain things. He said once that he was keeping them in case he ever needed to account for himself, in case anyone questioned his integrity. She looked up. After he died, I found them. I didn't know what they were. I still don't, not really. I kept them because Henry kept them. I didn't know what else to do. The air in the kitchen felt very careful. Can I see them? Elara said. Dorothy looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood up and went to the back bedroom, and Elara heard the sound of a trunk being opened, and when Dorothy came back, she was carrying a cigar box tied with twine. I don't know if this will help you, she said, but I know Henry would want it to help someone. Elara took the box home and put it on the table and sat across from Reed, and they opened it together. Inside were copies hand-copied in Henry Pike's precise bookkeeper's script of internal bank documents spanning 4 years. Transfer authorizations, property appraisals that had been deliberately lowballed, records of what appeared to be payments made to county officials, and at the bottom, folded with particular care, a document that was not a copy, It was an original. Bernard Voss's will, signed and witnessed on the 3rd of March 6 years ago, leaving the farm and all its acreage to his wife Elara in the event of his death. She looked at it for a long time, felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite grief, something older than either, something that had been sitting in her chest for months waiting to be named. Bernard had thought of her. In his cold, practical, unexpressive way, her husband had thought of her. He'd done the one legal thing that would protect her and then put it in a bank that was going to use it against her. He didn't know, she said. She wasn't sure if she meant it as excuse or explanation or something else entirely. Reed looked at the will, then at her. No, he said. He didn't know. He thought he was being practical. He thought the bank was a safe place for it. Yes. She folded the will carefully and held it in both hands. This changes things. Significantly, he was already thinking she could see the particular inward focus of someone sorting through implications. The forged debt documents Jerome brought become essentially moot. If you can establish the will as legitimate, Greer's foreclosure threat loses most of its legal basis. The will gives you clear title to the property, which means, but we can't just present it, she said. She'd been thinking too. Greer will claim it's fake or that it was improperly filed. He has the resources to tie it up in legal challenges for months, years, which is why we need what's in his office. He looked at her. The will is the foundation, but we need the proof of the pattern. The records that show Greer has done this before, that he knew the will existed and suppressed it deliberately. That's what makes this a crime rather than a paperwork dispute. She nodded. She looked at the cigar box with its careful copies. Henry Pike gave his life to that bank, she said quietly. He saw what it was doing and he kept copies, and it frightened him so much he never told anyone. He told you, Reed said. He just did it after he died. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that steady, difficult-to-read expression, and she thought not for the first time that she was beginning to read it better than she'd expected to. Sunday, she said. Sunday, he agreed. The morning of the 19th was clear and bitter cold. They rode into town in the gray hour before full dawn, Elara on colt behind Reed, her breath a constant cloud against the back of his coat. The town was not quite quiet. There were always early risers, stable hands, someone hauling water, but it was close enough to quiet for their purposes. The east window yielded easily. Reed's hands were practiced and certain in a way that should have frightened her and somehow didn't. They moved through the bank's main room without a light. The winter sun was just beginning to find the east-facing windows, and Reed went directly to the inner office door as if he'd walked this path before. You've been in here, she said. I talked my way into a meeting with Greer about refinancing options, he said, working the lock with a thin piece of steel he'd produced from somewhere. 2 days ago, spent 20 minutes watching his habits while pretending to read the documents he handed me. The lock gave. The filing cabinet on the left, 3rd drawer. She found it. The documents were not hidden exactly. They were simply filed under category labels that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. Property resolutions, settlement agreements, third-party facilitation. The language was the language of legitimate business, but the content read carefully with Henry Pike's copies, as a key was something else entirely. There were 17 properties documented, 17 farms and homesteads over 7 years. In each case, a clear pattern of financial pressure introduced or amplified, a distressed sale or foreclosure, executed a subsequent sale to a Denver investment group at 2 to 3 times the acquired price. And in 4 of the files, including the one labeled Voss B, a notation in Greer's hand will receive filed separately per arrangement. Per arrangement. With Jerome Voss, she understood now. Bernard's brother had told Greer about the will, had helped him suppress it. Her hands were very steady as she copied what she needed quickly in the thin winter light. Reed stood at the window watching the street. His shoulder, she noticed, had stopped paining him as visibly the rest, and regular food of the past week had done something, or perhaps he was simply operating on the particular fuel of a man who had found a problem he was equipped to solve. They were out within 40 minutes. Riding home in the growing morning, neither of them spoke for a long time. The plains spread out around them, white and vast and indifferent. The cold had a clarity to it that Elara had learned to appreciate. It stripped away everything unnecessary, left only what was real and present and requiring of attention. "You could have done this without me," she said at last. "I could have," he said. His voice rumbled slightly from the horse's movement from proximity. "But it would have meant nothing. The story only means something if you're the one who tells it." She thought about that for the rest of the ride home. They had 2 weeks before the town meeting that was held on the first Saturday of February, where county matters were discussed, and the various officials of Coldwell County made themselves available to constituents. 2 weeks to organize what they had to present it in a way that could not be dismissed or buried or quietly made to go away. Those 2 weeks were the most alive Elara had felt in years. They worked at the kitchen table every evening after dinner, sorting documents, organizing the evidence into a coherent timeline. Reed explained the legal architecture of what Greer had done. She translated it into language that a room full of farmers and their wives would understand in their bones. He knew the law. She knew the community. The combination was, she was beginning to realize, formidable. During the days they worked the farm, the animals needed tending regardless of what was happening at the kitchen table. The woodpile needed maintaining. The South Field's drainage situation needed to be assessed before the spring thaw made it impossible. Reed had ideas about the drainage, practical, specific ideas involving slope angles and tile placement that she found herself storing carefully against the future she was beginning cautiously to believe in. "Tell me about the school," he said one evening over the supper she'd made from their increasingly less sparse supplies. He'd brought home flour and beans and salt pork from town the previous day, paying from his own pocket with a matter-of-factness that she'd given up trying to argue with. She looked up from the document she was reviewing. "What school?" "You mentioned something to Dorothy Pike about the children in the area, about education. I was there at the window." He met her eyes. "You said there was no school close enough for most of these kids to attend, that they grew up without basic reading." She hadn't realized he'd heard that. She'd been standing on Dorothy's porch, and she'd been talking the way she sometimes did when she was comfortable enough to let herself talk. And she'd said things she didn't quite realize she believed until she heard them coming out of her own mouth. "There's nowhere for the children to go," she said. "The county school is 12 miles east. Half these families can't make that journey in winter. The kids come up illiterate, which means they stay poor, which means they're vulnerable to exactly the kind of thing Greer has been doing to their parents." Reed was watching her with an expression that was becoming familiar, the particular focus of someone who was listening not just to what was being said, but to what was beneath it. "You want to open a school," he said. "I want a lot of things," she said carefully. "What I have is a foreclosure problem and a county meeting in 2 weeks. Two things can be true at once." He paused. "My mother was a school teacher before she married to my father. She used to say the most radical thing you could do for a poor person was teach them to read, because it gave them access to every argument they might ever need." Elara looked at him for a long moment. At this man who had appeared in a blizzard and was sitting at her kitchen table talking about his mother with the quiet dignity of someone who had carried the memory a long distance and was glad to set it down for a while. "What was her name?" she said. "Catherine." A pause. "She would have liked you." The warmth that moved through her at that, the careful, unexpected warmth, was something she'd have to examine later. Later, when she had time. When the immediate crisis was resolved and she had space to look at what was forming between them and decide what to make of it. She went back to the documents. He went back to watching her in that way of his that she'd stopped pretending she didn't notice. 6 days before the town meeting, Elara Voss came back. He did not come alone. He came with two men whose purpose was evident in the way they stood, in the way they looked at things, the particular stillness of men who had been hired to be physically persuasive. Elara saw them from the window and went cold. She also saw Reed come out of the barn. He'd heard the wagon apparently and positioned himself in the yard between the approaching men and the cabin door, and she watched him stand there with his hands at his sides. Perfectly still, the shoulder held straight now rather than favored something in his posture that communicated very clearly, "This is not going to go the way you think." She went outside to stand beside him. Jerome looked between them. Whatever he'd expected to find, it wasn't this, the two of them standing together, Elara's chin up, Reed giving off the particular quality of patience that comes from someone who knows exactly how fast things can escalate and has decided not to let them. "Elara," Jerome said, I see you've made a new friend. Jerome, she kept her voice level. You should leave. I came to discuss the debt papers. You haven't responded. I've had them reviewed, she said, by someone who knows what he's looking at. You should leave, Jerome. You should leave, and you should have a conversation with your partner at the county bank about the town meeting next Saturday. A pause. Jerome's eyes moved to read. Something passed across his face, surprise calculation, something she might have named as the beginning of fear. You don't know what you're getting into, Jerome said. I know exactly what I'm getting into, Elara said. I know what was in my husband's will. I know where it went. I know whose name is in the notations. She paused. Do you want to continue this conversation, or do you want to leave? Jerome left, but that night 2 of his men came back. She heard at first not Bess, who was too far from the house, but the particular sound of men trying to move quietly and failing. She'd been awake. She rarely slept well anymore, her mind cataloging too much. She was already out of bed when she heard Reed's door open. She opened her own, and they were in the hallway together, both of them half-dressed, both of them alert. He looked at her face and apparently found his answer there because he went directly to the front door. What happened in the next 10 minutes she mostly pieced together afterward from what Reed told her and what she'd seen through the window. He'd gone outside. There had been 2 men waiting, and they'd been competent, if not exceptional, and Reed was a man who had spent 8 years in situations that could become violent without warning and had learned to operate effectively in them. He also had evidently a left hand that worked considerably better than his right at the moment and knew how to make the most of what he had. When it was over, and it was over quickly, in the way these things either end quickly or very badly, one man was running for the road, and the other was sitting in the snow at the edge of the porch, holding a broken nose and looking at the ground. Reed came back inside. His shirt was torn. His right shoulder had clearly been tested beyond what it should have been tested, and his face was very controlled in a way that meant pain was being managed, rather than absent. Elara didn't say anything. She went to get the medical kit. She worked in the kitchen by firelight, and he sat still and let her. The shoulder had reopened slightly at the original wound site, not badly, but enough to need attention. She cleaned it and pressed fresh bandages into place and felt his breathing, the deliberate steadiness of it. You're all right, she said. It was not quite a question. I've been in worse conversations. He paused. I'm sorry, I should have anticipated this. Jerome was going to push back. You anticipated it enough to be awake? She said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I'm getting better at anticipating things, since I've had more reason to. He looked at her sidelong carefully. She kept her eyes on the bandage. The town meeting is Saturday, she said. 6 days. He nodded. They'll know we have something. Jerome will have told Greer. They may try again. Let them try. The certainty in her own voice surprised her. 6 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, even she would have heard that certainty and doubted it. Now it felt simply true. She tied off the bandage and sat back. They were very close together in the small kitchen, the fire casting everything in amber. Night outside quiet, now the attacker's gone. She could see the lines of his face clearly, the weathering, the exhaustion, the thing underneath both of those that was younger and more uncertain, and she was beginning to understand was the part of him that had been most damaged by 8 years of guilt and most in need of somewhere safe to put itself. Why did you stay? She said. Really, after the first week. He looked at her for a long moment. Then with the same quiet directness he'd applied to every difficult truth since the first night. Because I haven't had anywhere worth staying in a long time, and this is worth staying for. A pause. You're worth staying for. She held that for a moment, turned it over, measured it against everything she knew about false starts and dangerous hope. Don't make promises you can't keep, she said. You said you wouldn't. That's not a promise, he said. It's just what's true. She looked at him for another moment. Then she gathered the medical kit and stood up and went toward her room. At the door, she stopped. The south field drainage, she said without turning around. Your idea about the tile placement. I want to hear the rest of it tomorrow. A pause, then quietly, yes, ma'am. She went to her room. She lay in her bed and listened to the sounds of him moving on the other side of the wall. The familiar sounds of another person in the house, the sounds she'd lived 3 months without, and had tried not to notice twice that she was missing. The town meeting was Saturday, But tonight was not catastrophe. Tonight was the warmth of a fire burning the evidence, organized, the bandage clean and properly placed, and somewhere on the other side of a thin wall, the first person in a long time who had looked at the full shape of her life and chosen to stand beside it. She let herself think for just a moment about what might come after all of this. Then she closed her eyes and slept better than she had in months. 2 days before the meeting, Greer made his move. He did not use men this time. He used information. A man arrived in town, a stranger, as Reed had once been a stranger, but with a different quality of purposefulness, and within a day the story was moving through Coldwell County's small communities that the man living at the Voss farm was a fugitive from Denver, a disgraced detective who had sent an innocent man to his death and fled the city before justice could find him. That Elara Voss had taken him in out of ignorance or desperation, that any claims coming from the Voss farm to the Saturday meeting should be evaluated in light of who was making them. Word reached Elara through Dorothy Pike, who arrived at the farm on Thursday morning with her jaw set and her eyes sharp with anger. "They're trying to discredit him," Dorothy said, sitting at the kitchen table with both palms flat on the wood. "They're saying he's a criminal, that you should send him away." Elara looked at Reed across the table. He was very still in the particular way she'd come to recognize. Not the stillness of someone suppressing emotion, but the stillness of someone who had known this was coming and had been deciding how to respond. "What they're saying is true," he said. He said it to Dorothy clearly and without defense. "Not about being a fugitive. I left Denver voluntarily, no charges. But an innocent man died because of my work. I won't pretend otherwise." He paused. "What I will say is that what's in those documents doesn't change because of who found them. Greer's crimes don't become less criminal because the man who documented them has his own failures." He looked at Elara. "I can stay away from the meeting if you think it's better." "You're not staying away from anything," she said. "Elara, they're trying to make the conversation about you instead of about what Greer has done to 17 families." She met his eyes. "I will not let them do that." Dorothy looked between them with the particular expression of a woman who has observed human nature closely for 50 years and is watching something she recognizes. "Good," she said. "Now, what are you going to say on Saturday?" They spent the next 2 days preparing. It was Elara who would speak. They had agreed on that Reed's past would be used as a distraction if he was the one presenting the evidence, and the distraction would swallow the evidence. Elara's standing in the community was different. She was Bernard's widow, a property owner, a woman who had lived in this county for 3 years and was known to be quiet and capable and not given to dramatics. They also had Dorothy. Dorothy, it turned out, had more than her late husband's copied documents. She had memory careful and precise of things Henry had said in the last year of his life. She had names. She had dates. She had the specific weight of a woman who had been carrying knowledge for 2 years and was finally being given somewhere to put it down. Saturday came gray and cold. The sky the color of old pewter. The roads packed hard with January ice. People came from miles in every direction. It was that kind of county where the Saturday meeting served as news exchange and social event and civic duty all at once. By the time Elara and Reed arrived, the hall was full. Harlan Greer was already there, standing near the front talking to the county official with the comfortable ease of a man who expected to be managing this room by the end of the morning. He saw Elara come in. His face went very professionally neutral. Jerome Voss was in the back corner. He was watching Reed. Reed looked at neither of them. He found a seat near the wall out of the main line of sight and sat with the particular patience of someone who has decided what their role is and intends to play it exactly. Elara went to the front of the room. When it was her turn, she stood up and she told the truth. She told it in the plainest language she knew, the way her mother had always said truth worked best, without ornament, without drama, simply and in order. She laid out what Greer had done, named the 17 families, explained the pattern. She produced copies of the documents Henry Pike had preserved and her own notes from the bank office. She produced her husband's will, the original signed and witnessed, and held it up so the room could see it. And then Harlan Greer stood up. He was very smooth about it. He acknowledged the seriousness of her concerns. He suggested in measured tones that a grieving widow might understandably be looking for explanations that weren't there. He noted that the man currently living on her farm, and here he let the pause do its work, had a troubled history that should raise questions about the quality of the evidence he had helped gather. The room shifted. Elara felt it, the particular uncertainty of people who want to believe but are afraid to. She was about to respond when a voice came from the far end of the hall. "I'd like to say something," Dorothy Pike said. She stood up slowly, this sturdy, gray-haired woman who had buried a husband and held her farm and kept a cigar box under a locked trunk for 2 years, not knowing quite why. She stood up and she said the name Harlan Greer had paid her husband in the last year of his employment to keep quiet about. She said the name of the Denver investor. She described in her late husband's words, as she had memorized them, exactly how the arrangement had worked. And then she put her hand into her coat pocket and produced a letter. Henry Pike's handwriting, written the month before he died. "Not to anyone in particular, addressed simply to any decent person who reads this after I'm gone," explaining what he had seen and what he had done and what he wished he had done instead. The room was very quiet. Harlan Greer's face had gone the color of old ash. "I kept it," Dorothy said quietly into the silence, "because Henry kept things. He said you never knew when honesty might need a record." She looked at Greer. "I think it needs one now." What happened next was not dramatic, as these things rarely are in reality. There were raised voices and formal objections, and someone sent for the county sheriff, and someone else sent for the judge, who lived 30 miles east and who arrived the following Monday, looking unhappy about the distance but having reviewed the documents on the ride. Jerome Voss left the hall quickly. He would be found 3 days later in Denver, which was both predictable and convenient for the warrants that followed. Harlan Greer did not leave quickly. He sat very still in the front of the room and spoke to his attorney in a low voice and did not look at Elara. She was looking at Reed. He was standing near the wall, his arms folded. His expression, the particular stillness she'd learned to read by now. When her eyes found his, something passed across his face that was not quite a smile and was somehow more significant than one. She had done it. They had done it. In a room full of people who might have been swayed by doubt and rumor, the truth had been too specific, too documented, too corroborated to be dismissed. The will would be submitted to probate. The foreclosure threat would be examined by a judge who preliminary reports suggested had his own questions about Harlan Greer. Jerome's forged documents were already evidence in a fraud investigation. Outside, the winter sky had cleared while they were in the hall. The afternoon sun lay thin and gold across the snow-covered main street of Coldwell County's small town, and it caught in the ice crystals at the edges of the road and made everything look briefly and probably clean. Elara stood at the top of the hall steps and breathed cold air and felt for the first time in a very long while the particular relief of something being over and something else beginning. Reed came to stand beside her. He said nothing. He didn't need to. "I need to buy flour," she said at last, "and seed for the spring planting, and probably some drainage tile for the south field." "Probably," he agreed. "You said your idea would require about 40 yards of tile and 4 days of labor." "Give or take." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the street, but not, she thought, really seeing it. 4 days is a long time to stay," she said carefully. He turned to look at her then. Full on the way, he'd been doing more and more with that direct, unguarded quality that still occasionally startled her, the quality of someone who had decided to stop using performance as insulation. "I told you," he said, "I'm not good at keeping promises I can't keep. So you're not going to make one. I'm going to ask you something instead." He paused, a beat, two, the cold air between them perfectly still. "What do you want, Elara? Not what you need, not what's practical. What do you want?" She thought about it honestly, the way he always seemed to invite. Thought about the will in her coat pocket and the farm that was going to survive the winter and the south field that needed draining and the children in this county who were growing up without the ability to read their own contracts, let alone fight back when someone tried to steal from them. "I want to still be here in 10 years, she said. "I want the south field drained and planted properly. I want a schoolhouse on the property, small, nothing fancy, somewhere the children around here can come without riding 12 miles in the winter." She paused. "And I want to..." She stopped. He waited. "I want to stop being afraid that everything good is temporary," she said. It was harder to say than any of the rest of it. "I want to stop bracing for the moment when it disappears." He looked at her for a long time. "I can't promise you nothing will ever disappear," he said at last. "That's not a promise anyone can make." He paused. But I can tell you that I've been running from things for 8 years and I am tired of it. I can tell you that I've been in this county for 3 weeks and I've started caring what happens to it in ways I didn't expect." He paused again. "I can tell you that being afraid is different from being alone. One of those I can do something about." She looked at him. At this man with his old wound and his honest admission of failure and his patience in his large, careful hands. "The South Field," she said. "First thing after the thaw," he said. "In the schoolhouse. Second thing." His eyes didn't move from hers. "What's the third thing?" She reached over and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers immediately, warm and certain. "Let's get the flower first," she said, "and then we'll talk about the third thing." He almost smiled. Not quite, but closer than she'd ever seen. They walked down the steps together into the cold afternoon light, and behind them in the hall, the shape of a future that had seemed impossible 3 weeks ago was being organized by people with ledgers and legal authority, and the Voss farm and its 45 acres, and its repaired barn roof and its planned spring crop was going to survive into the new season. The storm had passed. What it had brought with it was still there, standing in the January sun, holding her hand. Spring came to Coldwell County the way it always came. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in increments, so small you might miss any one of them. And yet one morning you would step outside and the air would smell different and the light would have changed its angle, and you would understand that the world had made a decision while you were sleeping. Elara was awake for every increment of it. She stood on the porch in early February and watched the first bare patches appear in the fields. She stood on the porch in late February and listened to the creek running higher than it had in months, the snow melt beginning its slow work. She stood there in early March and felt for the first time since October the sun land on her face with actual warmth, rather than the weak winter presence that gave light without heat. She did not stand there alone. The legal proceedings that followed the town meeting moved with the particular deliberateness of county courts that were being asked to hold a powerful man accountable. The judge who arrived from 30 miles east, a formidable man named Hargrove, who had it turned out received complaints about Greer before and never had sufficient evidence to act on them, examined the documents with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Bernard's will was submitted to probate and validated within the week. The 3 witnesses who had signed it were still in the county. 2 came forward immediately. The property reverted clearly to Elara. Jerome Voss's forged debt documents were examined by a document specialist brought from Colorado Springs. The finding was exactly what Reed had identified from the doorway of her cabin: wrong seal, mismatched handwriting, false witnesses. Jerome, who had been found in Denver attempting to liquidate assets with suspicious haste, was returned to Coldwell County in the custody of a deputy who looked extremely tired of the journey. Harlan Greer resigned from the bank before formal charges were filed. This was not, as Elara initially thought, an admission of guilt in any legal sense. It was the particular maneuver of a man with expensive legal counsel who understood exactly which concessions to make in advance of which battles. But what followed his resignation, as examination of the bank's records became possible in ways it hadn't been when he controlled them, was a systematic accounting of 17 years of what the judge eventually called predatory acquisition with intent to defraud. 9 families received their land back through legal remedies. 8 others had sold to the Denver Investment Group, and the properties could not be fully recovered, but settlements were negotiated that amounted to more money than most of those families had seen in a decade. Dorothy Pike, whose farm had been 4 months from foreclosure when the blizzard brought Reed Calloway to Elara's barn door, held her land and planted a kitchen garden in March that was the envy of the county. The Voss farm was not in doubt. Reed fixed the south field drainage in the second week of March as promised. He worked 4 days with a methodical patience that Elara found by now entirely characteristic, rising before dawn, organizing the tile placement, with the same careful attention to sequence and weight he brought to everything, checking his work twice before moving on. She worked beside him, doing the parts that didn't require a right shoulder at full capacity, and they talked while they worked the way people who have spent a winter in close proximity learn to talk continuously, easily, without the necessity of significance. He told her about Denver, about the years of detective work, the clients, the cases that interested him, and the ones that were just paying work. He told her about the case, not the bare-bones version he'd given her in the barn, but the full shape of it, the man's name, the evidence that had seemed conclusive, the terrible clarity of the moment 6 months ago, when new information had unmade 8 years of certainty. His voice was even as he told it, the evenness not of suppression, but of someone who had been doing the work of living with something and was beginning to understand the difference between carrying it and being crushed by it. She told him about her marriage. Not the careful version she'd offered earlier, sanitized for a stranger, but the real version, the specific loneliness of 3 years with a man who was not cruel but was simply absent in every way that mattered. The particular grief of mourning not what you had, but what you'd never had and had stopped believing you deserved. I kept thinking, she said one afternoon, sitting back on her heels in the mud of the South Field, that if I could just be useful enough, eventually he'd see me. Not as useful, but as real, as a person who was there. She paused. He never did. I don't think it occurred to him that I needed to be seen. Reed looked at her steadily from where he was positioning the last section of tile. I see you, he said simply. The way he said it made it neither dramatic nor complicated, just true. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. The drainage worked perfectly when the spring floods came. The south field absorbed the snowmelt and channeled it away the way it had never managed to do in 3 years under Bernard's neglect, and the soil that emerged afterward was dark and rich and ready. Elara stood at the field's edge and looked at it and felt something she was beginning to learn to recognize as pride in things she had actually done rather than things she'd survived. The schoolhouse took 2 weeks to build with help from 3 neighboring families who had children of appropriate age and were enthusiastic about the idea in the particular way of parents who want something for their children that no one was willing to give them. It was simple. 1 room, 6 windows, a good stone fireplace that Reed had designed with smoke flow in mind so the room would warm evenly. A door that hung true and latched firmly. 12 desks that were built from lumber by the farmers who helped rough-hewn but solid the kind of furniture that would outlast everyone who used it. She taught 8 children in the first session of April. They ranged from 6 to 13. Most of them knew their letters. Almost none of them could read a full sentence. Within a month, 3 of them were reading simple passages from the donated books she'd organized through Dorothy and the church ladies, and a particularly sympathetic merchant in town who turned out to have strong opinions about rural education. You have a gift for this, Reed told her one evening when she came in from the schoolhouse flushed with the particular satisfaction of a good day's teaching. My mother taught me, she said. She said reading was the first thing anyone owed a child. Before manners, before practical skills, before anything. A child who can read can find their way to everything else. Your mother sounds like Catherine, he said. Your mother. She looked at him. Yes. He smiled at that, a full smile, the kind she'd been seeing with increasing frequency over the weeks that changed his whole face and made him look younger and less defended. She would have loved this schoolhouse. She would have driven everyone crazy rearranging the books. I like that picture, Elara said. He looked at her across the kitchen table. The fire was good. The evening was quiet. Outside, the first real warmth of April was fading into a night that was cold, but not cruelly so, the kind of cold that was simply the temperature, not a threat. Elara, he said, Reed, I've been thinking about asking you something for about 6 weeks. She kept her expression composed, mostly. I know. He looked at her. You know. I'm perceptive. She paused. Also, Dorothy told me you'd asked her opinion about 2 weeks ago, and Dorothy is constitutionally incapable of keeping a secret from me. A pause. Then he laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the laugh she'd been collecting quietly since January, each one feeling like something given freely and unexpectedly. Dorothy, he said. She was enthusiastic, Elara said. She used the word obviously and she said it twice. He was still smiling when he reached across the table and took her hand. His thumb traced across her knuckles in the way that had become, over weeks, a language of its own, a language that said things they were still sometimes too careful to say directly. I don't have much to offer you, he said. My savings are not extensive. My reputation in Denver is complicated, and I make no promises about it recovering. I have a horse and some skills that are useful on a farm, and a shoulder that works better than it did 3 months ago, but will probably always have opinions about cold weather. I know all of that, she said. I know you know it. I'm telling you because I want to be clear about what I am before I ask you what I'm about to ask. He paused. I love you, Elara. I've been trying to find the right time to say it plainly, and I think the right time is probably right now before I lose my nerve. Another pause. I want to stay, not just through the planting season, not just until the legal matters are settled. I want to stay here on this farm and build something with you. I want to see what this place becomes when someone actually tends it properly. I want to watch you build that school into something that changes this county. He paused. I want to be the person who brings you coffee in the morning and means it. She looked at him for a more time, at this man who had come in amongst a storm broken and guilty and looking for nowhere in particular and had found somewhere to put everything he'd been carrying. You're proposing to me, she said. I'm asking, he said. There's a difference. If the answer is no or not yet or not like this, then that's what it is. I'm not making this conditional on anything. She had spent the winter learning to read him. She had learned to read the steadiness in him that was not rigidity, but something more like rootedness. The quality of a man who, once he stopped running, turned out to know quite well how to stand still. She had learned the way he held things carefully, whether it was evidence or a bandage, or the truth about his worst mistake. She had learned that when he said he would be somewhere, he was there. Yes, she said. He looked at her. That was quick, he said. I've had 6 weeks, she said. You're not the only one who's been thinking about asking something. He stood and came around the table to her, and she stood too. And when he took her face in his hands and kissed her, it was nothing like the careful restraint of the winter months. Nothing like the tentative approaches of two people who were afraid of what they were starting. It was the kiss of people who have been working towards something for months and have finally arrived and have the particular relief and joy of finding it exactly as good as they'd hoped. Outside, the April night was crisp and clear. The spring stars were visible through the kitchen window. The south field was properly drained and ready for seed. The schoolhouse stood solid on the edge of the property, windows dark for the night, desks waiting for tomorrow's students. They married in May. The ceremony was held at the farm on the porch and in the yard because the cabin was too small for everyone who wanted to come, and also because Reed, when asked, said he would like to be married outside where he could see the sky, and Elara had looked at him and said that seemed exactly right. Dorothy stood as her witness. 3 neighboring farmers stood for Reed, men who had come to know him over the months, who had seen him work and listened to him think, and concluded with the practical judgment of people who evaluate character by what a man actually does rather than what he says about himself, that he was the right kind of man. Reverend Collins came from town, the same man who had officiated Bernard's funeral, and he performed the ceremony with a warmth that surprised Elara, and that she later understood was the warmth of a man who had watched her endure and was glad to see her thrive. She wore the dress she had bought with the first money from the spring vegetable sales. Not fancy, a blue-gray wool that was good color for her dark hair, practical enough for the farm life she lived, but with a collar and cuffs that acknowledged the occasion. She had picked flowers from her own garden, the one Reed had designated as hers, lavender and early cosmos, and something small and yellow that she didn't know the name of, but that smelled like something she wanted to remember. He looked at her when she came out of the cabin, and his expression was the one she'd been cataloging all winter, open, unguarded, the expression of a man who had stopped needing to protect himself from things that were good. The vows were simple. She had written her own, which everyone seemed to find surprising and she found simply natural. I promise to see you, she said when it was her turn, every day for the rest of our lives. Not to use you or take you for granted or reduce you to your worst moments. I promise to build something with you that neither of us could build alone. I promise to argue with you when I think you're wrong and admit when I am. I promise that when things are hard, and things will be hard, we have both learned that I will stand beside you and not behind you. She paused. I promise to be honest with you because you have taught me that honesty is not the same as cruelty, and that real safety comes from being fully known. He held her hands through all of it with the careful, steady grip she had come to rely on. When he spoke, he looked directly at her, the way he always did, the pale gray eyes that she had stopped being surprised by and had simply begun to love. I spent 8 years running from the worst thing I've ever done, he said. I spent 8 years believing that mistakes couldn't coexist with decency, that what I did to that man meant I had forfeited the right to try for anything good. You showed me that was wrong, not by telling me, by doing the opposite, by taking a risk on a broken stranger and refusing to let the risk make you afraid. He paused. I promise to deserve that every day. I promise to be the kind of man who can look at what he's done and still be worth standing next to. He paused again. I promise to be here. That's the whole of it. I promise to be here. Dorothy was crying. She cried openly and without embarrassment, and later said she had been crying since January, and this was simply the appropriate culmination. The celebration lasted the afternoon. Neighbors brought food far more than the occasion required, with the generosity of people who have been hungry themselves and understand what it means to have enough. There was a fiddle player from 3 farms over who played until the light was gone. The children from the school danced in the yard and ate too much cake and ran through the fields until their parents collected them. Elara stood at the edge of her property in the May evening and watched all of this and held her new husband's hand and felt the particular careful joy of someone who has learned not to take good things for granted and is therefore more awake to them than most. You're thinking very hard, Reed said beside her. I'm counting, she said. Counting what? Things. She looked at the schoolhouse, the barn, the south field showing the first green of the season's wheat. That's the 3rd spring since I came to this farm. I've been counting the springs. She paused. This is the first one where I'm not afraid of the next one. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you think the next spring will bring? She thought about it honestly. More students. The word is getting around there are families from the Anderson Creek area asking about the school. I think we might need to expand the building before another year. She paused. Another good wheat harvest if the weather cooperates. The south field will help. She paused again. And I think she stopped. He looked at her. He had the patience of someone who had learned to wait for things that were worth waiting for. I think, she said carefully, that next spring might be the one where we have more people in this house than just the 2 of us. He was very still for a moment. Elara. I don't know yet. It's early, but I think so. He turned to face her fully, and the expression on his face was something she had never seen him wear before. Open in a way that went deeper than his usual openness, unguarded, in a way that she recognized as a man who had just confronted something entirely beyond his preparation and found it to be not frightening, but the opposite of frightening. We'll find out, she said, and whatever we find out, we'll figure it out together. He pulled her close and held her in the May evening, his arms around her, the farms surrounding them on all sides, and she could feel his heartbeat and hear the fiddle in the distance and feel the warmth of a season that had finally arrived. She was right. The next spring brought Clara. She arrived on a Tuesday in February in the narrow bedroom of the expanded cabin in the presence of Dorothy Pike, and the doctor who had ridden out from town, and 3 neighbors who had appeared without being summoned, bringing food and quiet company, and the specific comfort of people who understood that this kind of occasion required witnesses. Reed was present for all of it, which surprised the doctor and no one else. He held Elara's hand through the long hours, and when it was over and the baby was placed in his arms, for the first time, he looked down at his daughter with an expression Elara would spend the rest of her life trying to find adequate words for and never quite managing. Clara, he said, testing the name they'd chosen together. It meant light, clear, visible, unmistakable light, the opposite of hidden things. Clara, Elara confirmed. The baby looked at her father with the unfocused, ancient gravity of the newly arrived, and whatever she found in his face must have been satisfactory because she made a small sound that was not quite disapproval and closed her eyes. She has your practical nature, Reed said. She has your jaw, Elara said. Poor thing. He laughed, exhausted and undone and entirely happy. The years that followed had the quality of all good years, imperfect, occasionally difficult, full of ordinary pleasures that were not ordinary at all to people who remembered what their absence felt like. There was a drought one summer that damaged the wheat and required them to borrow against the property for the first time since the legal proceedings, and Elara sat with the papers and felt the old fears stir, and then looked across the table at Reed and watched him set out what they knew and what they could do, and saw that the fear was manageable because she was not alone in it. There was a winter when Clara got a lung sickness that kept them both at her bedside for a week, taking turns with the cool compresses and the elderberry tea, and the particular urgent prayers of parents who are discovering for the first time that the worst thing in the world is not their own danger, but their child's. She recovered slowly, then quickly, the way children often do, as if they had decided enough of that and were returning to their ordinary selves with impatience. When she was well enough to sit up and demand her favorite book, Elara cried with a relief so profound it surprised her even knowing it would come. The school grew. By Clara's third year of life, it had 15 students and a second teacher, a young woman from town named Helen, whose interest in the enterprise had begun as neighborly curiosity and deepened into vocation. By Clara's fifth year, the building had been expanded twice, and there were families from as far as 15 miles sending their children on Sunday nights to stay with relatives nearby so they could attend Monday through Friday. Reed found his own use in the county. Not detective work, he had not returned to that and was not sure he would. But the skills he had applied to it translated to other things. He helped three other families navigate the aftermath of Greer's bank collapse, sitting at their kitchen tables with their documents and explaining patiently and without condescension what their legal options were. He organized the county's first cooperative purchasing arrangement for seed and equipment, which saved enough money in its first year that people who had been skeptical became quietly evangelical about it. He wrote letters to Denver, long, careful letters that went through official channels and legal intermediaries and took 3 years to produce results, but in the end did what he had needed them to do. The case was reviewed. A formal acknowledgement was issued. The family of the man who had died received an apology from the detective agency and a financial settlement from the county, and his name was cleared in the official record. Reed told Elara about it the evening the letter arrived. He sat at the kitchen table and read it twice and then put it down and was quiet for a long moment, his hands flat on the table, looking at something she couldn't see. "You could have done this from Denver," she said. "No." He shook his head. "I needed to be somewhere that wasn't Denver. I needed to know I was still capable of doing something right before I had the nerve to go back and face what I'd done wrong." He looked up at her. "You gave me that. You gave it to yourself," she said. "I just had a barn that needed fixing." He looked at her the way he still looked at her sometimes, with a directness that she had stopped finding surprising and had simply come to love the look of a man who was present in his own life in a way that was earned rather than accidental. "Our barn now," he said. "Our barn," she agreed. Clara grew up with both gifts, her mother's precision with language and her father's ability to read a situation from the outside. She was 8 when she began helping with the younger students as 10, when she started organizing the lessons herself, 12, when she sat down across from Elara one evening and said with the particular calm of someone who has known something for a while and is finally ready to say it, "I want to teach when I'm old enough." "You're already teaching," Elara said. "Properly, the way you do." Clara looked at her with those gray eyes she'd inherited from Reed eyes that saw more than they admitted to. "I want this school to outlast both of you." Elara looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she called to Reed from the barn and told him what Clara had said, and the three of them sat at the kitchen table and talked about what it would take, what it would mean, how a school might be made permanent in a county that had once been run by a man who understood perfectly well that education was the enemy of exploitation. The 20th anniversary of the night Reed had knocked on the barn door, she always marked it from that first bang she'd heard through the storm. That sound that had pulled her out of her chair and set her feet toward the door fell on a Saturday in January. The farm was settled deep in winter. The fields covered the animals warm in the expanded barn. Clara back from her teacher's certificate coursework in Colorado Springs for the holidays. They sat on the porch in the afternoon cold, wrapped in blankets, watching the light change across the snow. "That was the worst winter I'd ever seen," Elara said. "The best I'd had," Reed said. She looked at him. He hadn't changed the way she'd thought he would, or maybe she had simply stopped seeing the changes because she was too close to them. The gray at his temples had been there for a decade. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper. The shoulder still had opinions in cold weather, as he'd promised it would, and he still rotated it with a particular habit every morning that she'd stopped noticing consciously but still registered. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "The day I rode out to look at the road from town," he said, 3 weeks in. "I told you I was going for supplies." "I wasn't. I was going to see if I could still leave." He paused. "I got about 2 miles out and turned around." She looked at him. "You never told me that." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "I couldn't tell you then because I didn't know what it meant. I thought maybe I was just practical, that it made more sense to stay and finish what we'd started." He paused. I know what it meant now. What did it mean? He turned to look at her, his pale eyes steady in the winter light, the eyes she had first seen in a lantern-lit barn when she was holding a pitchfork and deciding whether to trust a stranger. The eyes that had been the first thing she'd learned to read and were still 20 years on the thing she read most fluently. It meant I was already home, he said simply. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the good one, the right one, the one that had come back to full strength 2 springs into their marriage and stayed. He put his arm around her the way he had 10,000 times, the way that still felt like exactly the right shape of things. Clara came out onto the porch with 3 cups of coffee, handing them their cups, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had grown up in a household where coffee was a serious matter and had strong opinions about its preparation. "You're being sentimental," she observed, settling into the chair beside them with her own cup. "Your father is telling me things he should have told me 20 years ago," Elara said. "In my defense, Reed said 20 years ago I hadn't figured them out yet." Clara looked between her parents with the expression she had been wearing since approximately age 7, the expression of someone who had observed something being done well and was filing it for later reference. "You know," she said, "Helen's youngest asked me last week how you know when you found the right person. Her daughter is getting married in the spring." "What did you tell her?" Reed said. "I told her to ask you." Clara looked at her mother. "What do you tell them when parents ask you that? The students, when they're old enough?" Elara thought about it honestly, the way she always tried to answer honest questions. She thought about a pitchfork in a coal barn and a man who told the truth when evasion would have been simpler. She thought about a winter of kitchen table conversations and carefully organized evidence and the particular warmth of another person's breathing on the other side of a thin wall. She thought about a spring day in a schoolhouse with 12 desks and the expression on a man's face when he realized his daughter would teach in it. "I tell them to pay attention," she said, "not to what a person says they are, to what they actually do when it roasts them something." She paused. "I tell them to notice whether they feel more like themselves or less like themselves when that person is in the room, whether they can say true things." She paused again. "And I tell them that the right person isn't the one who makes things easy, it's the one who makes hard things possible." Clara was quiet for a moment, looking out at the winter fields. "That's good," she said. "I'm going to borrow that." "It's yours," Elara said. The afternoon light was doing what it did in January, arriving at an angle that made everything it touched look considered deliberate. The snow on the south field lay smooth and undisturbed, the field that was properly drained now, that had given them 10 good harvests in 12 years that would give them more. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of the property, dark and waiting for Monday. The barn was solid, its roof patched and repatched and re-roofed entirely, twice a structure that had outlasted the storm that first threatened it. Reed's hand found Elara's under the blanket. His thumb traced across her knuckles in the old language, the one they'd invented between one winter and spring 20 years ago, the one that still meant everything it had always meant. She held his hand back. In the county, in the 7 years since the cooperative arrangement had taken hold and the school had become permanent, something had shifted. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of shift that happened slowly, too slowly to be tracked on any single day, but that became unmistakable over years, families staying when they would have left, young people coming back when they would have gone elsewhere, and a community that was gradually developing the particular confidence of people who understand their own interests and have the tools to protect them. Harlan Greer had died in a boarding house in Denver in 1895, having never been fully prosecuted, but having been thoroughly exposed, which had its own particular justice. Jerome Voss had served 2 years for fraud and left the state afterward, which was fine with everyone. Dorothy Pike's kitchen garden was still the best in the county. She was teaching Clara's youngest student to grow tomatoes on the south-facing side of a fence with the focused enthusiasm of a woman who has found her purpose and intends to apply it until the end. The sheriff who had replaced the old sheriff, the one who had been notably unavailable during the events surrounding Greer's activities, was a young man named Calvin, who had been one of Elara's first students, who could read and write and balance accounts, and who had grown up believing that these skills were not gifts, but rights, and that the difference mattered. These were not dramatic outcomes. They were the outcomes of small decisions made by ordinary people over a long time, adding up to something that no single person could have planned and everyone had contributed to building. Elara thought about this sometimes on evenings when she sat on the porch and watched the county move through its seasons. She thought about the night of January 14th, 1889, when she had heard a bang from the barn and gone out into a blizzard that should have sent her back inside. She thought about the pitchfork and the lantern and the man in the shadows who had raised his hands and said, "I mean you no harm." She had not trusted him. Not then. She had made a calculation, the cold-minded calculation of a woman who could not afford the wrong decision, and she had decided that his horse was worth saving and that she could manage the risk. She had not trusted him. She had learned to trust him. That was different and better. It was a thing that had been built piece by piece through cold mornings and kitchen table conversations, and a barn roof patched in January, and a will recovered from a banker's drawer, in a school built on land that had once been 6 months from seizure. Trust that was built could hold. Trust that was simply given could be taken. She believed this so entirely that she taught it now to the students in the schoolhouse, that the most important things were not gifts from the world, but constructions you made yourself, and that the materials were always the same: attention, honesty, the willingness to stay when staying was hard. She had been teaching it for 15 years. She believed it would outlast her. Clara, finishing her coffee beside them, would make sure of it. The afternoon was fading, the January cold settling back in as the sun dropped toward the horizon. They would go inside soon to the warm kitchen and the dinner that needed making and the ordinary pleasures of an evening in a house that had noise in it. Clara's presence this week, her voice and her opinions and her particular laugh that sounded like Reed's, but came faster like Elara's laugh had always done. Reed stood up first, extending a hand to help her up, which was unnecessary, and which she accepted anyway because it was his hand, and that was reason enough. 20 years, he said, as they stood there a moment before turning to go inside. 20 years, she confirmed. Worth it. She looked at him, at the barn and the schoolhouse and the south field under its winter snow, and at the face of the man who had built and fixed and stayed. "Ask me in another 20, she said. He smiled, the full smile, the one she'd been collecting since that almost smile in the coal barn on the second day of his arrival, the one that still transformed his face in the way that still surprised her somehow. "Deal," he said. They went inside. The fire was good. The kettle was on. Clara was already at the table with a book, reading in the particular absorbed way that still made Elara's chest fill with something that was part pride and part recognition and part the simple joy of watching your child do something they love. The farm settled into evening around them, the way it always did, the way it had done for 20 years, gradually, with the quiet confidence of something that had decided to last. Outside, the January night was clear and cold and full of stars. The storm was long past. What it had carried into her life was still here, sitting at her kitchen table, pouring himself another cup of coffee and asking Clara something about the cooperative spring planting schedule, already planning for the next season. She stood in the doorway and watched her family in the firelight and felt the full weight of 20 years of choosing this every day and having it be exactly as good as she'd hoped when she first carefully let herself hope at all. "You're going to let all the heat out," Reed said without looking up. She closed the door and came in from the cold. She was already home.